As you are watching this, there is an object hurtling through the void of interstellar space at 61,000 kilometers per hour. It is Voyager 1, the fastest thing humanity has ever thrown into the darkness. It left Earth in 1977. It has been flying without stopping for nearly half a century. And after all that time, after all that distance, Voyager 1 has not even travelled one single light day from Earth. Not one light day. Alpha Centauri, the nearest star system to our Sun, is 4.37 light years away. That is not 4 days. That is 4 years and 4 months at the speed of light itself. And Voyager 1 is not travelling at the speed of light. It is crawling. At its current velocity, Voyager 1 would take approximately 75,000 years to reach Alpha Centauri. 75,000 years. To put that in perspective, 75,000 years ago, modern humans had barely begun migrating out of Africa. The entire history of civilization, every empire, every war, every poem, every invention, every single thing humanity has ever done fits inside a window of about 10,000 years, and we are talking about a journey that would take 7 times longer than all of recorded human existence combined. So here is the idea that some very serious scientists and engineers have proposed. What if we build a ship, a massive ship, a ship so large it is essentially a small world, and we fill it with people, and we send them on a one-way journey to Alpha Centauri? The people who board that ship will never arrive. Their children will never arrive. Their grandchildren will never arrive. Generation after generation will be born inside that ship, live their entire lives inside that ship, and die inside that ship. And maybe, if everything goes perfectly, if nothing breaks, if no one goes insane, if society does not collapse, if the ecosystem does not fail, if the genetics do not degrade, if the destination is actually habitable, then maybe, after 400 years or more, the distant descendants of the original crew will step out onto the surface of an alien world orbiting a distant star. That is the idea. That is the dream. And on the surface, it sounds magnificent. It sounds like the ultimate expression of human ambition and courage. But when you actually sit down and examine what this would require, when you look at the biology, the psychology, the engineering, the sociology, the genetics, the physics, the ethics, every single angle, what you discover is not a story of triumph. What you discover is that a generation ship to Alpha Centauri would be, in almost every conceivable way, a floating nightmare. And I am not saying that to be dramatic. I am saying that because the science says so. The data says so. The experiments we have already run right here on Earth say so. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why. So if this kind of deep scientific exploration is your thing, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me whether you would board this ship if you had the chance. Because after what you are about to hear, I genuinely want to know your answer. Let us begin. Before we talk about the ship, we need to talk about where it is going, because the destination matters enormously, and the destination itself is already a problem. Alpha Centauri is not one star. It is a triple star system. 3 stars bound together by gravity, performing an elaborate gravitational dance that has been going on for billions of years. The first 2 stars are Alpha Centauri A and Alpha Centauri B. Alpha Centauri A is very similar to our Sun. It is a G-type main sequence star, slightly larger, slightly brighter, but fundamentally Sun-like. Alpha Centauri B is a bit smaller, a K-type star, cooler and dimmer than its companion. These two orbit each other every 80 years or so in a wide elliptical path. And then there is the third member of this stellar family, the one that matters most to us, Proxima Centauri. Proxima is a tiny red dwarf star, an M-type star, much smaller and dimmer than either of its companions. It orbits the Alpha Centauri AB pair at an enormous distance, roughly 13,000 astronomical units away, taking about 547,000 years to complete a single orbit. But here is why Proxima matters. It is the closest star to our solar system. At 4.24 light-years away, Proxima Centauri is marginally closer to us than the Alpha Centauri AB pair. And in 2016, astronomers using the European Southern Observatory discovered a planet orbiting Proxima Centauri. They called it Proxima Centauri b. Now, when that discovery was announced, the world went wild. Headlines everywhere declared that we had found an Earth-like planet orbiting the nearest star, and on paper, certain numbers looked promising. Proxima b has a mass of about 1.17 Earth masses. It orbits within what astronomers call the habitable zone of its star, meaning the region where liquid water could theoretically exist on the surface. Its year is absurdly short by Earth standards, just 11.2 days, because it orbits extremely close to its dim parent star. But here is where the dream starts to crack. Proxima Centauri is what astronomers call a flare star. It is violently unstable. It regularly erupts with massive stellar flares that blast anything in its vicinity with extreme ultraviolet radiation, hundreds of times greater than what Earth receives from the Sun. Research from NASA has specifically stated that an Earth-like atmosphere may not survive Proxima B's orbit. The radiation environment is simply too hostile. On top of that, Proxima b is very likely tidally locked, meaning one side permanently faces its star in eternal scorching daylight, while the other side faces away in perpetual freezing darkness. Whether it has an atmosphere at all is completely unknown. Whether it has a magnetic field to shield its surface from radiation is unknown. Whether liquid water exists on its surface is unknown. The truth is, Proxima Centauri b might be a barren, radiation-blasted rock with no air, no water, and no possibility of supporting life as we know it. And here is the cruel irony that sits at the heart of this entire generation ship concept. You would build the most ambitious, most expensive, most complex engineering project in the history of humanity. You would condemn dozens of generations of human beings to live and die inside a sealed metal cylinder hurtling through the void. 400 years of sacrifice, of struggle, of birth and death, and everything in between. And when the ship finally arrives, when the descendants of the original crew finally gaze out the windows at their promised land, they might find nothing. A dead world. A world that cannot support them. The Chrysalis Generation ship design team, the group that won the Project Hyperion competition in 2025, has acknowledged this possibility openly. They have stated that if Proxima b turns out to be uninhabitable, terraforming could take 3,000 additional years, 3,000 years on top of the 400-year journey. That means more generations, dozens more generations, living and dying inside the ship, orbiting a planet they can see through the windows but can never touch. Now let us talk about the journey itself, because the numbers involved are genuinely difficult for the human brain to process. 4.37 light years. That sounds almost modest, does it not? 4.37. A small number. But light years are deceptive in their simplicity. 1 light year is approximately 9.46 trillion kilometres. So 4.37 light years is roughly 41 trillion kilometres. 41 trillion. If you started counting to 41 trillion right now, one number per second, without sleeping, without eating, without stopping, it would take you over 1.3 million years to finish counting. That is the distance we are talking about. And speed is the great limiting factor of this entire enterprise. The speed of light, approximately 300,000 kilometres per second, is the absolute cosmic speed limit. Nothing with mass can reach it, let alone exceed it, and our actual spacecraft are laughably slow compared to light. Voyager 1, as we discussed, would take 75,000 years. The Parker Solar Probe, which at its closest approach to the Sun, reaches speeds of about 192 kilometres per second, making it the fastest human-made object in history, would still take approximately 6,800 years to cover the distance to Alpha Centauri. Even at 1% of the speed of light, which is 3,000 kilometres per second, the journey would take about 437 years, and at 10% of the speed of light, which is 30,000 kilometres per second, you are looking at roughly 44 years. The Chrysalis generation ship design, the one that won the Project Hyperion competition, targets a cruise velocity of 1% of the speed of light. That gives a journey time of approximately 400 years. And that 1% figure is not arbitrary. It represents roughly the upper limit of what might theoretically possibly be achievable with advanced fusion propulsion technology. The kind of technology that does not actually exist yet. The Chrysalis design proposes using deuterium and helium-3 fusion. Based on concepts from Project Daedalus, a theoretical study conducted by the British Interplanetary Society in the 1970s, the acceleration phase would push the ship at 0.1 g, 1/10 of Earth's gravitational pull, and the deceleration phase would do the same in reverse, slowing the ship down to enter the Proxima Centauri system. On paper, this works. In reality, we have never built a fusion engine that produces net positive energy, let alone one capable of propelling a 58-kilometre-long spacecraft. The International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, ITER, currently under construction in France, is our most ambitious fusion project, and it is designed merely to demonstrate that sustained fusion is possible. It is not a propulsion system, it is a proof of concept, and it has been under development for decades, costing tens of billions of dollars, and it has not yet produced a single watt of fusion power. So when someone tells you a generation ship will use fusion propulsion, understand that this is not engineering, this is hope, this is aspiration. And there is nothing wrong with aspiration, but we need to be honest about where we actually stand. And then there is the fuel problem, which might be even more fundamental than the engine problem. Rocket propulsion obeys something called the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation, and it is brutally unforgiving. The equation tells us that the amount of fuel you need increases exponentially with the speed you want to achieve. The faster you want to go, the more fuel you need. But more fuel means more mass. More mass means you need even more fuel to push that additional mass. It is an exponential trap, and it is why rocket scientists sometimes refer to it as the tyranny of the rocket equation. For a generation ship massing millions of tons, the fuel requirements to reach even 1% of light speed would be staggering. Helium-3, one of the proposed fusion fuels, is extraordinarily rare on Earth. It exists in meaningful quantities on the lunar surface, implanted by the solar wind over billions of years, and in the atmospheres of gas giants like Jupiter and Saturn. So before you can even begin to fuel a generation ship, you need an industrial infrastructure capable of mining helium-3 from the Moon or from Jupiter's atmosphere. That infrastructure does not exist. The technology to create it does not exist. The economic framework to support it does not exist. We are talking about prerequisites to prerequisites to prerequisites. Layers upon layers of things that must be invented and built and tested and scaled up before the first drop of fuel goes into the first tank of the first generation ship. But let us set aside the propulsion problem for a moment. Let us assume generously that we solve fusion, that we figure out the fuel, that we can actually push this ship to 1% of light speed. Now we have to build the ship itself, and this is where the engineering nightmare truly begins. How big does a generation ship need to be? Think about what it must contain. It is not a vehicle, it is a world. A small, enclosed, entirely self-sustaining world that must support human life for 4 centuries or more. It needs living quarters for thousands of people. It needs farms to grow food. It needs ecosystems, actual functioning ecosystems, with plants and animals and soil microbes and nutrient cycles and water cycles and atmospheric regulation. It needs hospitals. It needs schools. It needs workshops and factories for manufacturing replacement parts. It needs laboratories for scientific research. It needs recreational spaces because human beings go insane without recreation. It needs parks and open areas to provide some psychological sense of space and freedom. The Chrysalis design envisions a ship 58 kilometres long, a multi-layered rotating cylinder divided into 5 sections. Each section contains rotating levels that generate artificial gravity through centripetal force. Each section includes 2 shells dedicated to biomes, complete ecosystems mimicking different Earth environments, and 1 shell dedicated to agriculture and food production. The design includes parks, grasslands, art galleries, libraries, living quarters with customizable interiors created through three-dimensional printing, and a feature they call the Cosmos Dome, a massive transparent structure where the governing council would meet, with a direct view of the stars. It is, on paper, beautiful. It is breathtaking. It reads like the set design for a science fiction film. But here is the problem. Actually, here are many problems. First, Cameron Smith's research, published in Acta Astronautica in 2014, concluded that you need a minimum of 10,000 people to maintain genetic diversity over a multi-generational voyage, and ideally 40,000. The chrysalis design accommodates 1,000 to 2,400 people. That is a fraction of the minimum. The ship's own genetic foundations are, according to the best available science, insufficient. Second, where do you build a 58-kilometre-long spacecraft? You cannot build it on Earth's surface. The gravity well alone makes it impossible to launch something that massive. It would need to be assembled in orbit, piece by piece, over decades or possibly centuries. The materials, millions of tons of metals and composites and glass and structural elements, would need to be launched into space or mined from asteroids. This requires an orbital industrial infrastructure that does not exist and would itself take generations to build. Third, and this is the one that keeps engineers awake at night, everything on this ship must work for 400 years, without resupply, without spare parts from Earth, without software updates from mission control, without any external help whatsoever. Think about that. The longest continuously operating complex human machine might be certain nuclear submarines, and those have service lives of 30 to 40 years with major refits. The International Space Station has been operating since 1998 and requires constant resupply missions from Earth. Equipment breaks. Systems fail. Components degrade. Seals crack. Electronics corrode. Software develops bugs. And on the ISS, when something breaks, a cargo ship brings replacement parts from Earth within weeks. On a generation ship 4 trillion kilometres from home, when something breaks, you either fix it with what you have on board, or everyone dies. A paper by Hine and colleagues published in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society explicitly states that a world ship would require automatic fail detection and self-repair systems at a level of reliability that currently does not exist in any technology we have developed. A single critical failure, one hull breach, one air processor that cannot be repaired, one water recycling system that collapses, and the entire population of the ship could perish. Now I want to take you to a place in the Arizona desert, because what happened there tells us something terrifying about the feasibility of generation ships. In September 1991, 8 people, 4 men and 4 women, walked into a structure called Biosphere 2. It was a $150 million glass enclosed facility covering 3 acres. Inside, they had built a miniature Earth, a rainforest with a 25-foot waterfall, a savanna with grass and trees, a desert, freshwater and saltwater wetlands, a coral reef in a 25-foot deep, 150-foot long artificial ocean, an agricultural area with 80 different crops. They had rice, yams, peanuts, wheat, carrots, bananas, tomatoes, beans, sweet potatoes, and dozens more. They raised small pigs, pygmy goats, and chickens. 3,000 species of plants and animals coexisted inside that glass dome. The goal was simple. Seal 8 humans inside this mini biosphere for 2 years and see if a closed ecological system could sustain human life. It was, at the time, the most ambitious experiment in closed system ecology ever attempted, and it was in many ways a preview of what a generation ship would require, except infinitely simpler. Only 8 people, only 3 acres, only 2 years. On Earth, with help right outside the glass. And it went horribly wrong. Within months, the crew realised that oxygen levels were falling. Not slowly, steadily and measurably. What they discovered was that microbes in the organically enriched soil were producing carbon dioxide at a faster rate than the young plants could absorb it and produce oxygen through photosynthesis. To make matters worse, much of the carbon dioxide was being absorbed by the unsealed concrete in the facility's structure, locking away both carbon and oxygen in a form that the biosphere's systems could not recycle. After 16 months, oxygen levels had dropped from 20.9%, which is normal, to 14.2%. 14.2%. That is equivalent to living at 15,000 feet of elevation. For reference, the summit of many serious mountains sits at that altitude. Half the crew developed symptoms of altitude sickness. They suffered sleep apnea. Their cognitive function declined so severely that the project's doctor, who was one of the 8 crew members, found one day that he could not add a simple column of numbers. Think about that. The doctor responsible for monitoring everyone's health could not perform basic arithmetic because his brain was not getting enough oxygen. At that point, the team decided they had reached a dangerous breaking point, and refrigerated trucks were brought in to pump pure oxygen into the facility from outside. The seal was broken. The experiment, in the strictest sense, had failed. But the oxygen crisis was far from the only problem. The crew was hungry. Desperately, constantly hungry. Despite farming being their primary activity, consuming 25% of their waking hours, 3 to 4 hours per day, 5 days per week, they could not grow enough food. Mark Nelson, one of the crew members, later wrote that he lost 25 pounds during the experiment. He described eating peanuts with their shells still on because he was so hungry. They existed on what their doctor called a healthy starvation diet, initially around 1,800 calories per day, eventually rising to 2,200 as their farming skills improved. But the hunger never truly went away. Meanwhile, the ecosystem was developing problems of its own. Cockroaches, which had snuck into the facility as stowaways, experienced a population explosion and began threatening the crops. Ants did the same. Morning glory vines went on what Nelson described as a purple rampage in the rainforest, choking other plants and requiring hours of manual labour to control. Species that were supposed to coexist in careful balance began competing aggressively, and the crew had to constantly intervene to prevent one species from overwhelming another. And then there was the human element. 8 people. 8 highly educated, highly motivated people who shared a common goal and had volunteered for this mission, and within months they split into 2 hostile factions of 4. Psychologists have a term for this. They call it irrational antagonism. It is what happens when people are confined together for extended periods with no ability to leave. The specific trigger was a power struggle over the project's direction, but the underlying cause was simpler and more primal. Human beings are not designed to be sealed in boxes together. The resentment became so severe that crew members would walk past each other without making eye contact. One crew member later reported being spit at. Twice, despite reading books on group dynamics and conducting homegrown therapy sessions, the social divisions persisted throughout the entire 2-year experiment. Now here is what makes this relevant to generation ships. Biosphere 2 was 3 acres. A generation ship would need to be thousands of times larger. Biosphere 2 housed 8 people. A generation ship would need to house 10,000 or more. Biosphere 2 lasted 2 years. A generation ship would need to last 400. Biosphere 2 was on Earth, with a hospital minutes away, with emergency oxygen available, with the option to simply open the doors and walk out if things became truly dangerous. A generation ship would be trillions of kilometres from the nearest help, with no emergency oxygen delivery, no hospital, and absolutely no option to open the doors and walk out. If the oxygen started dropping on a generation ship, if the crops started failing, if the cockroaches started swarming, if the crew started fracturing into hostile factions, there would be no trucks rolling up to pump in fresh air. There would be no option to end the experiment. There would be only the ship, the void, and the slowly growing realization that something has gone catastrophically wrong, and there is nowhere to run. The Chinese conducted experiments with their Yuegong-1 facility and achieved roughly 1 year of closed ecological life support. The Soviet BIOS experiments in Krasnoyarsk achieved up to 180 days of full closure. These are the longest successful closed ecosystem experiments in human history. 180 days. 1 year. We are talking about a generation ship that must maintain a closed ecosystem for 400 years. 400 years. The gap between what we have demonstrated and what we would need is not a gap. It is an abyss. It is the Grand Canyon of engineering challenges, and we are standing on one side with a running start and a dream, looking at the other side and pretending we can jump. And there is a specific nightmare lurking within the closed ecosystem problem that does not get enough attention. Soil. We think of soil as dirt, as something passive and inert. It is not. Soil is one of the most biologically complex substances on Earth. A single handful of healthy soil contains more microorganisms than there are people on the planet. Those microorganisms are responsible for breaking down organic matter, recycling nutrients, fixing nitrogen, maintaining the chemical balance that allows plants to grow. On Earth, these microbial communities are part of a vast, interconnected web that has been evolving and self-regulating for billions of years. On a generation ship, you would need to replicate that web in a sealed container and keep it functioning for centuries. And here is the thing about microbial ecosystems. They evolve, they change, they adapt to their environment. Over decades and centuries, the microbial communities in the ship's soil would evolve in ways that we cannot predict. Nutrient cycles could shift, toxic compounds could accumulate, beneficial microbes could be outcompeted by harmful ones. A single pathogenic organism, one fungus, one bacterium, could evolve to devastate the ship's crops, and in a closed system with limited biodiversity, there might be no natural defence against it. On Earth, when a crop disease strikes, we can import resistant varieties from other regions, apply treatments, or simply grow something else. On a generation ship, there is no other region, there are no imports, there is only what you have on board, and if what you have on board develops a fatal flaw, you are trapped with it. Let us talk about radiation, because this is the problem that turns a difficult engineering challenge into a potential biological catastrophe. Here on Earth, you are protected from the worst of space radiation by two shields. The first is Earth's magnetic field, the magnetosphere, a vast bubble of magnetic force that deflects the majority of charged particles streaming in from the sun and from deep space. The second is the atmosphere itself, a thick blanket of gas that absorbs and scatters the radiation that does make it through the magnetic field. On a generation ship in interstellar space, you have neither. There is no magnetosphere, there is no atmosphere, there is only the hull of the ship and whatever shielding material you have built into it, and between you and the full fury of the cosmos, that is all there is. The radiation environment of interstellar space is dominated by two threats. The first is galactic cosmic radiation, just CR, high-energy particles that originate from outside our solar system, from supernovae and other violent cosmic events. GCR is composed primarily of protons, about 87%, helium nuclei, about 12%, and heavier atomic nuclei, about 1%. That 1% includes some of the most dangerous particles in the universe, so-called jet ions. Atoms of elements like iron and silicon stripped of their electrons and accelerated to nearly the speed of light. These particles carry enormous energy. They can penetrate several centimetres of solid material. Research has shown that a hydrogen ion passes through every cell nucleus of a human body every single day in deep space. Heavier Z particles hit every few months. And when these particles pass through living tissue, they do not just pass harmlessly through. They rip through DNA like a bullet through wet paper, creating double-strand breaks, single-strand breaks, and oxidative damage that can lead to mutations, cancer, cell death, and a cascade of biological harm. The second threat is solar particle events, massive bursts of protons and heavy ions ejected by the sun during solar flares and coronal mass ejections. These events are unpredictable and can deliver lethal doses of radiation in hours. On Earth, we are protected. In deep space, a solar particle event could irradiate the entire crew of a generation ship unless they have adequate shielding or a dedicated safe room. And there is a third, less obvious radiation threat that is specific to spacecraft. When high-energy cosmic rays hit the hull of the ship, they do not simply bounce off. They interact with the atoms of the hull material, triggering nuclear reactions that produce a shower of secondary radiation, including neutrons, gamma rays, X-rays, and other particles. This intravehicular radiation can actually be more dangerous than the primary radiation, because the secondary particles can have different energy levels and penetration characteristics than the originals. Your shielding, in other words, can become a source of radiation itself. The health effects of prolonged radiation exposure in deep space are extensive and deeply concerning. Cancer risk increases significantly. Cataracts develop. Apollo astronauts, who spent only days in deep space during their lunar missions, showed unusually high rates of cataracts later in life. From just days of exposure, a generation ship crew would be exposed for their entire lives, and their children would be exposed from the moment of conception. Central nervous system effects have been documented in animal studies. Low doses of galactic cosmic radiation can impair learning and memory, and in severe cases, kill neurons outright. Executive cognitive functions, the ability to plan, to make decisions, to solve complex problems, may deteriorate over time. The cardiovascular system is affected. The immune system is suppressed, with documented cases of latent herpes viruses reactivating in astronauts. Wound healing is impaired. And perhaps most troubling of all, the genetic damage accumulates across generations. A child born on a generation ship would inherit whatever genetic damage their parents accumulated from radiation exposure, and that child would then accumulate their own damage on top of that inherited damage, and their children would inherit even more. Generation after generation, the mutational load would increase. After 10 or 15 generations, the cumulative genetic damage could be catastrophic. Shielding is the obvious solution, but shielding comes with its own nightmare. The most effective shielding materials against cosmic radiation are hydrogen-rich substances like water and polyethylene. NASA has estimated that adequate protection would require approximately 50 grams per square centimetre of aluminum-equivalent shielding. For a ship housing thousands of people with enormous habitable volumes, this translates to millions of tons of additional mass. And here is the trap. More mass means more fuel needed for propulsion. More fuel means more mass. We are back to the tyranny of the rocket equation, except now we are adding millions of tons of shielding on top of the already enormous mass of the ship itself, and its cargo of humans and ecosystems. Active shielding, using powerful magnetic or electric fields to deflect charged particles, has been proposed, but it remains completely unproven at the scale that would be required. And even with the best conceivable shielding, some radiation will always penetrate. Over 400 years, even a small residual dose adds up. The cumulative exposure across multiple generations is a biological time bomb with no known diffusal mechanism. Now let us talk about what happens to the human body in space, even setting radiation aside, because the physical challenges of multi-generational space habitation go far beyond radiation damage. Generation ship designs typically propose using rotation to generate artificial gravity through centripetal force. The ship spins, and the outward centripetal effect mimics gravity, pressing inhabitants against the outer walls of the rotating structure. In theory, this provides a gravitational environment similar to Earth's. In practice, it is far more complicated. First, the strength of the artificial gravity varies with distance from the axis of rotation. At the outer rim, gravity might be close to 1g. Closer to the centre, it decreases. At the axis itself, it is 0. This means that different parts of the ship experience different gravitational forces. Walking from one section to another could mean walking from 1g to half a g to near 0g and back again. The human body, adapted over millions of years to a constant 1g environment, would struggle with this variability. Second, rotation creates Coriolis effects. Moving objects within a rotating reference frame experience forces that make them curve unexpectedly. This affects the fluid in your inner ear, the organ responsible for your sense of balance. In a rotating habitat, residents could experience chronic vertigo, nausea, and disorientation, particularly when moving their heads or walking in certain directions. The smaller the radius of rotation, the worse these effects become, which means you need a very large rotating structure to minimise them, yet another reason the ship must be enormous. Third, and this is a concern that does not get nearly enough discussion, we have absolutely no data on what happens to the human body over multiple generations in artificial gravity. We know what 1G does. We have some data on what microgravity does over periods of months to a year, but we have zero data on what rotating artificial gravity does to human development, to pregnancy, to fetal growth, to childhood bone and muscle development, to aging, to any of the biological processes that unfold over a lifetime, let alone over dozens of lifetimes. The people born on this ship would be the experiment. They would be the data, and if something goes wrong, if artificial gravity at slightly less than 1G causes subtle developmental problems that only become apparent after 3 or 4 generations, there would be no way to correct course. You cannot redesign the ship's rotation while it is in flight with thousands of people living inside it. There is also a deeply unsettling possibility that does not often get discussed in popular accounts of generation ships. The human beings who arrive at Alpha Centauri after 400 years might not be the same kind of human beings who left Earth. Not philosophically. Biologically, natural selection does not stop just because you are on a spaceship. If anything, it accelerates. On a generation ship, the environmental pressures are radically different from Earth. Radiation levels are higher, which increases mutation rates. The gravity might be slightly different. The diet is limited and monotonous. The air composition might fluctuate. The microbial environment is artificial. Over 15 or 20 generations. Humans born and raised in this environment would begin to adapt to it. Bone density might decrease if the gravity is even slightly less than 1G. Immune systems would adapt to the ship's specific microbial population and might be completely helpless against the microbes on a new planet. Muscle structure, respiratory capacity, cardiovascular function, all of these would be shaped by the ship's environment rather than Earth's. The generation that finally arrives at Proxima Centauri b might find that their bodies are physically incapable of functioning on a planetary surface with real gravity, real atmosphere, and real microorganisms. They would be generation ship humans, adapted to a world that is 58 kilometers long and made of metal, and they might be as poorly suited to a planet as a deep sea fish is to a mountaintop. And now we come to what I think is the most terrifying problem of all. Not the engineering, not the biology, not the physics, the humans themselves. Because you can build the strongest hull, the most efficient life support system, the most advanced fusion engine, and it will not matter if the society inside the ship tears itself apart, and the evidence strongly suggests that it would. Let us start with the genetics problem and what it implies for social organisation. Cameron Smith's research is clear. You need at minimum 10,000 people to maintain genetic diversity over 30 generations. But genetic diversity is not just a numbers game. It requires that those 10,000 people reproduce in specific patterns. Not everyone can mate with everyone. Certain genetic pairings need to be encouraged, and certain pairings need to be discouraged to prevent the accumulation of harmful recessive traits. In practice, this means that a generation ship would require a managed breeding program, a system, likely computerized, that tracks the genetic profile of every individual and determines which reproductive pairings are genetically optimal. Think about what that means for the people living on this ship. You fall in love with someone. You want to have children with them. But the genetic management system determines that your combined genetic profiles carry an unacceptable risk of producing offspring with a specific hereditary disease. Your request to reproduce is denied. Or alternatively, the system determines that your genetic profile is exceptionally valuable and assigns you a reproductive partner whom you have never met and do not love. This is not science fiction. This is the logical, unavoidable consequence of maintaining a viable population in a small, isolated gene pool over centuries. And it is, by any modern ethical standard, a form of eugenics. controlled breeding based on genetic criteria. One of the darkest chapters in human history involved exactly this kind of thinking applied to human populations. On a generation ship, it would not be optional. It would be necessary for survival. Now overlay that with real-world examples of what happens to small, isolated human populations. The Amish communities in North America, a genetically isolated group descended from a small number of founders, have significantly higher rates of certain genetic disorders, including Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome and various metabolic disorders, because the limited gene pool allows harmful recessive traits to become concentrated. Ashkenazi Jewish populations, similarly isolated genetically for centuries, have elevated rates of Tay-Sachs disease, Gaucher disease, cystic fibrosis, and other conditions. The Pitcairn Island community, descended from the Hun's Bounty mutineers and a small number of Polynesian companions, experienced severe social and genetic problems in their tiny isolated population. These are real-world examples of what happens when human gene pools are restricted. On a generation ship, the restriction would be more severe, the isolation more complete, and the duration far longer than any of these historical examples. Without aggressive genetic management, hereditary diseases could become rampant within 5 to 10 generations. With aggressive genetic management, you preserve genetic health but create a society in which reproductive freedom does not exist. Either path leads somewhere deeply disturbing. Let me take you inside the psychology of confinement, because what we know about human behaviour in enclosed, isolated environments should terrify anyone who seriously contemplates a generation ship. In 2010 and 2011, the Mars 500 experiment sealed 6 men inside a simulated spacecraft for 520 days to study the psychological effects of a long-duration space mission. 520 days, not even 2 years, and the results were sobering. The participants experienced depression, chronic sleep disorders, lethargy, and interpersonal conflicts. Their activity levels declined dramatically. Some became almost entirely sedentary. Their sleep-wake cycles drifted out of alignment with each other, creating tension and reducing opportunities for social interaction. And these were carefully selected, psychologically screened volunteers who knew they could leave at any time if the experiment was terminated. They knew they were on Earth. They knew there was an outside. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted the Stanford Prison Experiment. He assigned college students randomly to the roles of prisoners and guards in a simulated prison environment. Within 6 days, the experiment had to be stopped because the guards had become abusive and the prisoners had become psychologically broken. 6 days in a simulation, with participants who knew it was an experiment and could have walked away at any time. The lesson was stark. When you put humans in confined environments with power hierarchies, their behaviour degrades rapidly and dramatically. Imagine not 6 days but 400 years. Imagine not a simulation but reality. Imagine not the option to leave, but the absolute certainty that you cannot. Now think about the specific psychological horror faced by what I call the middle generations. These are the people born in the middle of the journey, perhaps generation 5 or 8 or 12. They did not choose to be on this ship. They were born here. They will die here. They will never see Earth, a planet that is to them nothing more than stories and recordings, and perhaps increasingly distant myths. They will never see Alpha Centauri either, the destination for which the original crew sacrificed everything, because they will die long before the ship arrives. They exist in a permanent state of transit. Their entire lives, from birth to death, take place in a metal cylinder hurtling through an infinite void. They serve a purpose they did not choose, working to maintain a ship they did not build, heading toward a goal they will never achieve, and they can never leave. There is a philosophical concept called solastalgia, which describes the grief and distress caused by the loss of a familiar environment. On Earth, it applies to people who watch their homeland degraded by environmental change. On a generation ship, it would apply to an entire population grieving for a world they have never known. Earth, open sky, wind, rain, oceans, mountains, the sound of birds, the feeling of the sun on your face. None of these things exist on the ship. None of them will ever exist for these people, and they know with absolute certainty that for them this is all there is. This box, this corridor, this recycled air, this artificial light. Forever, consider the implications for mental health, depression, anxiety, a pervading sense of meaninglessness, suicide, in a confined environment with limited mental health resources where the underlying cause of psychological distress, the confinement itself, can never be alleviated. What happens when the rate of suicide on the ship begins to threaten the population's viability? What happens when an entire generation simply loses the will to continue? And now let us zoom out from the individual to the society, because the social dynamics of a generation ship are perhaps the most unpredictable and dangerous variable of all. Every human society in recorded history has experienced political conflict, power struggles, factions, revolutions, wars, every single one. There is no exception. From the smallest tribal community to the largest empire, the struggle for power, for resources, for status, for ideology has been a universal constant of human civilization. What makes anyone think a generation ship would be different? Who governs the ship? This is not a trivial question. It is the question upon which everything depends. Democracy, dictatorship, technocracy, a council of elders, an artificial intelligence. Each system has failure modes. Democracy requires an informed electorate and the willingness to accept outcomes you disagree with. In a stressed, resource-scarce, confined environment, both of these requirements become fragile. Dictatorship provides stability, but breeds resentment and eventual violent overthrow. Technocracy, ruled by technical experts, sounds rational but ignores the emotional and social needs of the population. And any system of governance must persist, coherently and effectively, for 400 years. No system of governance in human history has remained stable and unchanged for 4 centuries. The Roman Republic lasted about 500 years, but it was transformed beyond recognition multiple times during that period, eventually becoming an autocratic empire. The Chinese dynastic system persisted for millennia, but experienced regular collapses and rebuilds, each accompanied by massive violence and upheaval. There is no reason to believe that a generation ship's political system would be any more stable than any other human political system in history. And on a generation ship, political instability is not just inconvenient, it is existential. A civil war on Earth destroys cities and kills people, but the planet endures and civilization can rebuild. A civil war on a generation ship could damage the hull, destroy life support systems, wreck the agricultural biomes, sabotage the navigation systems. A single act of political violence, one bomb in the wrong place, one saboteur targeting a critical system, and everyone on board dies. The science fiction author Algis Budrys described this dynamic in 1966 with haunting precision. He wrote about the slower-than-light interstellar spaceship, pursuing its way through the weary centuries, its crew losing touch with all reality save the interior of the vessel, and the unhappy downhill round, and the exciting struggles between the barbarian tribes which develop in its disparate compartments. Barbarian tribes. On a spaceship. It sounds absurd, but it is the logical endpoint of centuries of social drift in a confined population. Think about the class system that would inevitably develop. Resources on a generation ship are finite and tightly controlled. Food is limited, living space is limited, water is limited, air is limited. Who decides how these resources are distributed? Whoever makes that decision holds enormous power, and power corrupts. History has shown us this over and over again, without exception. A hierarchy would form. It always does. Some families would end up in better living quarters, some would have access to better food, some would be assigned to the dangerous maintenance tasks, repairing the hull, maintaining the engines, working in the agricultural sections, while others would hold administrative or leadership positions. Over generations, these distinctions would harden into something resembling a caste system. The families who hold power would seek to maintain it for their children. The families who do not would grow resentful. The generation ship would recreate in miniature. every inequality and injustice that has plagued human societies since the invention of agriculture. And then there is the question of crime and justice, which on a generation ship takes on a uniquely nightmarish quality. What do you do when someone commits murder on a ship from which no one can leave? You cannot exile them. There is no exile. There is nowhere to go. You cannot imprison them for extended periods because resources are too scarce, and every human on the ship represents labour and genetic material that the community cannot afford to lose. But you also cannot simply forgive, because unpunished violence would destroy the social fabric faster than almost anything else. What about theft of food or water, which in a resource-scarce environment could be a matter of life and death? What about sexual violence, which data from confined military and naval environments suggests is a persistent problem? What about the person who simply refuses to do their assigned job, who decides they do not want to spend their life as a plumber when the ship needs plumbers? On Earth, you can quit your job and find another one. On a generation ship, your job is assigned based on the ship's needs, not your preferences. Refusing to work is not just an individual choice, it is a threat to everyone's survival. How do you handle that? How do you balance individual freedom with collective necessity in a sealed container where literally everything is a matter of life and death? The Chrysalis team's proposed solution to some of these social problems is chilling in its implications. They suggest that crews should be pre-selected and trained over 3 to 4 generations living in experimental biospheres in Antarctica, specifically to cultivate, and I am quoting here, a strong group identity and an almost tribal sense of cooperation. In other words, they propose breeding and conditioning humans for compliance over multiple generations before the ship even launches. The generation ship, in this conception, does not begin when the ship leaves Earth orbit. It begins decades or centuries earlier, in Antarctica, where families are selected, monitored, tested and shaped to produce the kind of humans who will not rebel, who will not question, who will not resist. The word for this, in a less polite context, is social engineering on a genetic and cultural level. It is the creation of a human subspecies bred for obedience and cooperation, specifically designed to survive inside a machine. Whether this is inspiring or horrifying depends on your perspective, but I think most people, upon reflection, would find it deeply troubling. And here is something that almost no one talks about when they discuss generation ships, but which I think might be the most fascinating and disturbing problem of all. Language. Human language is not static. It evolves constantly. It mutates. It drifts. Old English, the language spoken in England 1,000 years ago, is completely unintelligible to modern English speakers. If you heard a sentence in Old English, you would not recognise it as English at all. And that transformation happened in a population of millions, with written records, with literary traditions, with institutional efforts to preserve and standardise the language. Now imagine a population of 10,000 people, completely isolated from every other human community in existence, sealed in a metal cylinder for 400 years. Linguists have documented that smaller, more isolated populations experience faster rates of linguistic change. The Amish in America speak a dialect of German that has diverged significantly from the German spoken in Germany, despite being separated for only a few centuries and maintaining written texts in Standard German. The inhabitants of Pitcairn Island developed their own Creole language within a few generations. On a generation ship, the language spoken by Generation 15 would be fundamentally different from the language spoken by Generation 1. The manuals, the technical documents, the scientific records, the operating procedures written by the original crew, all of them could become progressively unintelligible to later generations. The Chrysalis team proposes solving this by creating an artificial common language, supposedly refined over generations during the Antarctic pre-selection phase, but this betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of how language works. Languages cannot be frozen. They evolve because humans evolve. Social dynamics change. New concepts emerge. Old words acquire new meanings. Slang develops. Pronunciation shifts. Grammar simplifies or complicates. No amount of institutional control has ever successfully prevented language change, not the Académie Française in France. not the state-sponsored language standardization efforts of any government in history. Language changes because people change, and people always change. And with language, culture drifts. The culture of Generation 15 would bear little resemblance to the culture of Generation 1. The ship is the only environment these people have ever known. Their art, their music, their stories, their values, their understanding of the universe, all of it would be shaped by the ship, not by Earth. Earth would become increasingly mythological. A paradise lost. A creation story. A golden age that exists only in recordings and databases. The original mission, reach Alpha Centauri and colonize a new world, might lose all meaning for people who have never seen a planet, who have never felt wind or rain, who have never stood under an open sky. John Brunner wrote a science fiction story in 1957 called Lungfish, in which the descendants of a generation ship crew had no interest at all in life on a planet. They had adapted to the ship. The ship was their world. The planet was alien and frightening. This is not far-fetched. It is psychologically predictable. If you have lived your entire life in a controlled, enclosed environment, the prospect of stepping out onto an open planetary surface with its unpredictable weather, its unknown microbes, its vast open spaces, would not be exciting. It would be terrifying. And what about religion? History tells us that in times of stress, confinement and uncertainty, religious movements surge. New faiths emerge. Existing faiths transform. On a generation ship, the journey itself could become the basis of a new religion. The founders could be deified. The mission could become a sacred narrative. The scientific understanding of why the ship exists and where it is going could be replaced, over generations, by a mythological framework that serves the same emotional function but bears no resemblance to the truth. The Cosmos Dome, that beautiful transparent structure where the governing council meets with a view of the stars, could become a temple. The ship's operational manual could become a holy text, revered but no longer understood. We have seen this pattern repeated throughout human history. The Library of Alexandria's knowledge was lost. Civilizations that built aqueducts and roads forgot how to build aqueducts and roads. Knowledge is more fragile than we like to believe, and in an isolated, stressed population with no external input, the erosion of knowledge is not a possibility. It is a near certainty. Let me now talk about something that makes this entire conversation even more unsettling, and it has to do with what happens if the generation ship actually arrives at its destination. Let us say everything goes right. The ecosystem holds, the genetics are managed, the society remains stable, the engines work, 400 years pass, and the ship enters the Proxima Centauri system. The descendants of the original crew look out through the Cosmos Dome and see, for the first time in their lives, a star that is not a distant point of light, but an actual nearby sun. They see Proxima Centauri b. They have arrived. What happens next? First, as we discussed, Proxima b might be uninhabitable, a dead rock blasted by stellar flares, with no atmosphere, no water, no hope. In that case, the arrival is not a triumph, it is a tragedy. Dozens of generations lived and died for nothing. The ship becomes a permanent habitat orbiting a useless star, and the cycle of generation after generation living and dying in a metal box continues, perhaps forever. But let us be generous. Let us say Proxima b has some potential. An atmosphere, even if it is not perfect. Water, even if it is locked in ice. The possibility of terraforming. Even in this optimistic scenario, the problems are immense. The generation ship humans, as we discussed, may be biologically adapted to the ship's environment. Their bone density, their muscle mass, their immune systems, their respiratory capacity, all shaped by 400 years of artificial gravity, recycled air, and a controlled microbial environment. Stepping onto a real planet, with real gravity that might be slightly different from the ship's rotation, with real air that might be slightly different in composition, with real microorganisms that their immune systems have never encountered, could be physically dangerous or even lethal. They would be aliens on a world they were supposed to call home. And then there is what I think is the cruelest possibility of all, and it was first described in science fiction but is mathematically plausible. The weight calculation problem. Technology improves over time. If you launch a generation ship today at 1% of light speed, it will take 437 years to reach Alpha Centauri. But what if, 50 years after you launch, technology has improved to the point where a ship can travel at 5% of light speed? That new ship would reach Alpha Centauri in about 87 years. It would arrive 300 years before your generation ship does. And what if, 100 years after you launch, technology has improved to 10% of light speed? That ship arrives in 4 years. It arrives almost 4 centuries before your generation ship. The generation ship crew, after 400 years of sacrifice, after dozens of generations of people living and dying in a sealed cylinder, would arrive at Proxima Centauri to find that a colony has already been established by people who left Earth centuries after they did, but arrived centuries before them. Their sacrifice was unnecessary. Their suffering was pointless. Everything they endured could have been avoided if they had simply waited. This is not science fiction, it is mathematics. If technology continues to improve at any reasonable rate, it will almost always be more efficient to wait and launch later with better technology than to launch now with inferior technology. The generation ship is, in this analysis, always the wrong choice. Now I want to talk about the specific ways in which the ship itself could kill everyone on board, because the engineering failure modes of a generation ship are numerous and spectacular. Start with the hull. Interstellar space is not as empty as you might think. It contains gas, mostly hydrogen, and dust, tiny particles of various materials. At low speeds, these particles are harmless. At 1% of the speed of light, 3,000 kilometers per second, they become lethal projectiles. A dust grain weighing 1 milligram, essentially invisible, striking the ship at 1% of light speed would impact with energy comparable to a small explosive charge. A larger particle, a pebble, a fragment of rock, would hit with the force of a bomb. Over 400 years of travel, the ship's forward-facing surfaces would be subject to a continuous bombardment of these high-velocity impacts. The ship would need a massive forward shield, perhaps a thick layer of sacrificial material designed to absorb impacts. This shield would slowly erode over the centuries, and it could not be replaced or repaired in flight. If the shield fails, if a particle large enough punches through, the hull breach could decompress an entire section of the ship in seconds. Everyone in that section would die. The engines represent another catastrophic failure point. Fusion engines, assuming they can be built at all, would need to operate for centuries. No human engine has ever operated for even a fraction of that time. If the propulsion system fails during the acceleration phase, the ship never reaches its cruise velocity, and the journey time extends by centuries or more. If it fails during the cruise phase, the ship may drift off course and miss the target system entirely, sailing past Alpha Centauri into the infinite void of interstellar space with no way to stop or turn around. If it fails during the deceleration phase, the ship arrives at Proxima Centauri at 1% of light speed, far too fast to enter orbit, and blows through the system in a matter of hours, unable to stop, condemned to continue into the endless dark forever.